Good evening, everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of Conversations with Hari. As you might be aware, Conversations with Hari is a series of conversations that I do with very interesting people from across India. And one of the segues of that, or one of the sort of streams of those conversations, are really interesting authors that I partner with different publishing houses, particularly Westland, to talk to very interesting authors that are publishing books, contemporary books that are of interest to people. Today, I have a very, very interesting author to talk to. Somebody that I've talked to in the past, Sri M, somebody who is well known as a spiritual master, as a yogi, and as a person who has written a number of books on a very fascinating series of experiences he's had in his own life, culminating in where he is today. Uh, Sri M is also very interesting to me as an author because beyond of the usual sort of type of spiritual material that he's also written before this latest book, a novel, which I thought was quite unique and differentiated and very interesting, which I had a chance to actually go through. The latest book, which is the subject of our discussion this evening, is this one. It's a book on yoga. It's called Yoga Also for the Godless, which is a very interesting title, a very intriguing title, and therefore it caught my attention. And I definitely wanted to go back and talk to Sri M this evening. So welcome all of you to a conversation this evening with Sri M.
Thank you, Hari. Thank you very much.
Okay, Sri M.
A pleasure to see you again.
Yes, we met last time, I think 2 years ago. That was a wonderful conversation.
In Madanapalli, yes.
That's right. That's right. And it's always been on my this saying that I must talk to you again. So very happy to have
Thank you.
that occasion again. Let me just jump straight into the book and ask you. This is interesting because in a conversation 2 years ago, I don't know whether you remember this. 2 years ago, you mentioned to me that one day you will write a book which had exactly this title, Yoga for the Godless. And I was very intrigued when I saw this book has actually happened. And I was therefore very keen to sort of know more about it. So tell me, how did this book come about? What was the process you went through? And what is this really about?
So, I remember this, that it was about 2 years ago. I almost forgot. When you reminded me, I got it. See, just before we met, there was a young lady who came to me who said, "Sir, I am born a Hindu, but I do not believe in any religion. By nature, I am kind of an atheist." She said, "Kind of an atheist." Okay. So, I don't know what that means. I am kind of an atheist. But I am very interested in yoga. I said, "But then you should take up the practice." So she said, "This is the problem. I have gone to a couple of teachers to learn yoga. They say that you have to do, say, this stotra or that stotra. You have to, worship something and then worship some deity and then start the practice of yoga." So I don't want to worship any deity because that is my mindset. See, I don't know whether I am right or whether I am wrong, but this is my mindset. But I think yoga is very beneficial. So is there some way? Also, she was a little bit put off by some of the characters in the drama called Gurudom. She said, when I go to learn yoga or a technique of meditation or something, they kind of give me the feeling that I should worship them or fall at their feet and consider them as the greatest of gurus and things like that, which I don't want to do. Without all this, is it possible? Because that day I was wearing a t-shirt and jeans and walking around. She said, "You look normal." I am not normal actually. I don't know if I am subnormal or abnormal. But she said, "You look normal. So, what do you say about this question? Can I also learn yoga?" I said, "You certainly can learn yoga." And that idea was sitting in my head, the seed. They are already there. I did a lot of research. I knew some things about this matter, but I did a lot of research. And I found that among the 6 darshanas or systems of philosophy in India, there are 2 which are very close to being atheistic, very close. I won't say totally. One is one of the most ancient darshanas called Sankhya. Sankhya Darshana of Kapila. Kapila is supposed to be the founder of Sankhya. Now, the word Sankhya means figures actually, numbers. Sankhya, which simply means to show that it is a very logical, rational, step by step philosophy. And it is very ancient and it is so important. Kapila himself is so important because even in the Bhagavad Gita, you can say Krishna says or you can say Vedavyasa says, either way. When Krishna is describing his glories, like saying among the Vedas I am Samaveda, not Rigveda, Samaveda from which all the music comes in this country. Of the Vedas I am the Samaveda, of the mountains I am the Meru, of the immovables, Achalas, I am the Himachala, and so on. When it comes to Rishi and Muni, he says among the Munis I am Kapila. You see the importance of Kapila here, and therefore Sankhya and the many terms of Sankhya like Tattvas, Sattva, Rajas, Tamas, these are all Sankhyan terms from Sankhya. They have been used in Vedanta, they have been used in other philosophies many times. Now, per se, Sankhya is an atheistic philosophy and dualistic in the sense, when I say dualistic, it means there are 2 eternals there. One is Purusha and the other Prakriti. Now, Prakriti is responsible for this entire creation and dissolution and so on. And according to Sankhya, it's like some of the scientists today say, not all, but many say that it is a chemical combination, this earth, this evolution. Where Sankhya differs is that they postulate a consciousness also called Purusha. While this world comes out of the chemical and so on and so forth, there is a Purusha or consciousness behind this. He is not a creator. Creation is all Prakriti's job. Through combination and so on, through Sankhya, Purusha is the essence of awareness and consciousness, which is primordial, has been existing since nobody knows, eternally. Now the thing is, as far as human beings are concerned, they also have Prakriti, made body, and consciousness as Purusha. Now when you say Purusha, it doesn't mean male, okay, here. Both male and female have Purusha, which is consciousness, it means consciousness. To show the importance of being positive, they have keep the name as Purusha. Right. So the whole process of Sankhya is to free the Purusha from the influence of Prakriti, so that it realizes, the mind realizes that I am actually not alive because of Prakriti, but because of Purusha. Not alive, not aware. I am aware because of Purusha, conscious. When this is realized, then the practitioner also begins to understand that there is only one Purusha, the primordial wisdom, which appears as different due to the play of Prakriti. So the whole process is that. However, Sankhya is not such a practical system. Although the Mahabharata says that there is no knowledge equal to Sankhya and no power equal to yoga. Now this is where yoga comes. Yoga is a specific darshana, it is not part of Sankhya, but 60 to 80% of terminology is borrowed from Sankhya, including the concept of Purusha. Yeah. Now in Sankhya also there is a mention of Ishvara. That Ishvara is not a creator, not someone who gets angry, who creates human beings in a workshop, throws them down and then make them suffer through COVID and so on and so forth. That kind of Ishvara Sankhya doesn't believe in, nor does yoga. Yoga derives the concept of Ishvara from the Sankhyan concept of Ishvara, which means a primordial, all-pervading, pure awareness and consciousness. The importance of yoga is that it is a practical technique, step by step, by which this Purusha can be realized. Right. So it started with this lady's questions, and then I said, I did a lot of research and figured out that you can also practice yoga and attain perfection in samadhi, which is called Kaivalya in Yoga Shastra, not moksha but Kaivalya. Kaivalya is derived from the Sanskrit word Kevalam, that means only one existing, which means at the end of his journey, the yogi realizes that there is only one Purusha, the primordial Purusha, which is the essence of all wisdom and consciousness, and that he is not different from that. Now for that, yes, why he doesn't realize till now is because the mind is agitated. So the yoga is a way. So therefore I said, let me write this book. Because why did I write it sloka by sloka from the Yoga Sutras? Because otherwise people say, oh, this is some newfangled idea, nothing to do with the Yoga Sutra. So I said, let me go step by step.
Wonderful. No, this is beautiful because I think it gives tremendous context to thinking about yoga itself, and I think that's very important. But also segues me beautifully into the structure of the book. So as you know, I've been sort of practicing yoga in some form, in a basic form, I must admit, but for a long time. Now in my 11th year, and I find that what this book gave me is that the first time I actually went down and actually sat down and read all the sutras.
Yeah, very good. That's nice.
There, and I was very happy because it actually gives a lot of clarity in sequence, and I think that was because otherwise you kind of committed from
right, which is why I went with the Yoga Sutras, because there is a sequence.
Right, correct, and I think that's powerful.
Yeah.
So So let's not get into the sutras because that's all, after all, what everybody is going to read. So I don't want to sort of take away the bang, so to speak, by talking about it. But I think what was very interesting for me was to know the structure of Patanjali's Yoga Sutra itself.
Right.
The very 4-stage or the 4-part structure, which I didn't know honestly, and that was very interesting to me. So the Samadhi Pada, the Sadhana Pada, the Vibhuti Pada and the Kaivalya Pada, which are all, as you say these words, you start to understand what they probably mean. But once I read your book, it became very clear. So do you think it's a good idea to get into each one of these sections in a little bit and summarize?
Sure.
Yeah, so we'll start with Samadhi Pada first.
Yes, please. I have the book right here. So now, Patanjali begins the Yoga Sutras with the rather terse sutra, which simply states, Atha Yoga Anushasanam. Here begins the study of yoga. No background, nothing. Here begins this. It's a direct jump into the subject. And the first part is the Samadhi Pada. Now many people practice yoga, which means asana, and little bit of pranayama, and a little bit of meditation. These are all parts of yoga, of course. But since Patanjali starts with Samadhi Pada, which means first he goes into an analysis of consciousness. What is it that the yogi wants? Why is he doing? Not physical health, yes, one side. Mental health, okay, one side. Beyond that, what does the yogi want? So, Samadhi Pada is a step-by-step description of the different layers. It's actually a great psychiatric study of consciousness. Let me put it this way. It's not mere philosophy. We might have to look at it a little carefully. what Patanjali says is that we have not actually explored the entire gamut of our consciousness. This is in Samadhi Pada. When you reach the stage called Samadhi, then you are going into tremendous fields of consciousness, awareness, and also capacity. Which is why in Vibhuti Pada the capacities are described. Sadhana Pada, how to develop is described. We will come to that, as you said. So, Samadhi Pada is an analysis of ordinary consciousness of the world, consciousness of the inner mind and the inner self, and step by step how to penetrate into the essence of consciousness. This is actually, that is the aim of yoga. This is the aim of physical health is required, because without physical health you can't have mind health. Mind health is required because with an agitated mind you cannot find such tremendous sources of energy, fields of energy. Called field, the word used for field in Sanskrit is kshetra, not only temple. Kshetra means a field. A temple is called kshetra because there is a field out there.
The field of action.
Exactly. So, so this is Samadhi Pada, and it goes into, I have gone into detail describing. Sutra 12 says there are different ways of attaining this Samadhi. One of them is Abhyasa, practice. Abhyasa of Vairagya, dispassion. Abhayam, fearlessness. You have to come out of the shell thinking that I am a weak fellow, I can't do more than this. That has to break. That can happen only with fearlessness, abhaya. And restrain. Because we are looking at tremendous energies and we keep dissipating these energies in little things. So, if you can restrain yourself and fix your attention in that, it could be spiritual, or according to Vibhuti Pada, it could be also one of those extraordinary achievements of human beings, many geniuses and so on. So, in effect, what Patanjali says is that when you understand the meaning of Samadhi, then you understand, and in Sutra 23 there is something called Ishvara Pranidhanatva, which means this can happen also through surrendering to Ishvara, also, which means there are other ways also of doing it.
Got it. And that's your point in the larger point, right?
Yes.
I mean, while that's a legitimate path, it's definitely not the only path. And I think
exactly
that's the larger point.
That is my point. When Patanjali says in Sutra 23, oh, this is the Sadhana Pada, sorry, Ishvara Pranidhanatva, that va is added, means also, which means there are ways by which it can be done without Ishvara Pranidhana also. That's what it means.
Got it. Got it. So Samadhi Pada, if I were to sort of summarize for the audience out there, so essentially does two things the way I saw it. One, it gives you the preparatory framework of looking at the problem, of looking at the whole thing.
Where are we going?
Saying, you know, where, so what are all the things there? And using all this, what do we want to achieve? Where do we want to get?
Exactly.
I think these two are really what I saw as coming out of Samadhi.
Yes, which means not only physical perfection, but mind perfection, strength of mind, capacity to concentrate, and so on, till we reach the highest level of consciousness where one realizes one's identity with Purusha, Kaivalya Pada, last.
Got it. So that's wonderful. So that's in a sense set the stage. Let me put it that way. For us to move into the next part, which is of course the Sadhana Pada.
Sadhana.
So maybe you can explain Sadhana Pada and what it's all about.
So after discussing at length the thing called Samadhi Pada, which is the background where we are moving. In fact, there are certain schools which do not advise people to practice anything until they understand why they are practicing it.
Okay.
Because you may practice and find something and won't know what to do with it, or you may be completely confused. So, Samadhi Pada is important. Then comes practice, Sadhana Pada. Now, sadhana, after saying Yoga Anushasanam, Atha Yoga Anushasanam, Patanjali describes, defines yoga as yoga's chitta vritti nirodha. Yoga is the clearing of the mind stuff, of all the vrittis. When you say vrittis, it could actually mean disturbances that are caused due to conflicts, due to likes and dislikes, due to suddenly facing danger, due to attachment, but also non-attachment, both. Aversion. So, how to free the mind of these? So, this is the practice of yoga. So, it is yoga's chitta vritti nirodha. Then he goes step by step on how to bring this about, and in Sutra 5, in the practice, he says there are 5-fold fluctuations in the mind, painful and tormenting, and also those that are pleasurable, which can cause trouble.
Got it.
So, one of them is interesting. One is, then he goes on to enumerate the 5 kinds of fluctuations. He says one of them comes through valid knowledge.
Oh, okay, interesting.
Pramana. The second is illusions, viparyaya. Third is delusion, because only words are used but really it doesn't mean it. This I can easily tell you. There are different kinds of smiles. There is a smile called, I like them, a smile of a stewardess, which means nothing. I mean, it's their practice to smile. So, here when you say vikalpa, it means you are smiling, but actually you don't want to smile. So, what happens? Then the mind is actually in tension, because you are showing something out, saying, oh, you are a wonderful person, thinking, my God, this idiot, he has again come, how much shall I talk to him, or things like that. See?
Interesting,
So
very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is such a real thing, because it happens in life.
It's real.
Right? Yeah.
So, vikalpa, this is called vikalpa. Then, it's also caused through sleep, nidra. So, there are people who continuously sleep. They're afraid of even waking up, because you have to see the real world.
True.
And the maximum drugs sold in the world is for how to sleep,
Go to sleep.
sedatives. And then also memories, because there are good memories and bad memories, smriti. So, these 5 are discussed like that. It goes into details of discussing how we should get out of this.
Right.
So, the whole practice now, nowhere in the Yoga Sutras, in the Sadhana Pada, does Patanjali call it Ashtanga Yoga.
Oh, okay.
Nowhere. However, in fact, he calls it.
But he refers to.
He calls it Kriya Yoga.
Right.
He said self-study and giving attention to the Ishvara, here it means Purusha, is called Kriya Yoga. This is how he calls the Sadhana Pada, the practice. But why is it sometimes referred to as Ashtanga Yoga? Because step by step practices are divided into 8 parts, Ashta. Although he doesn't call it, he calls it Kriya Yoga. But now those 8 parts start with Yama and Niyama first, rules and regulations to be practiced by the yogi, which is serious yogi who wants to finally reach Kaivalya. If it's just physical health that one is concerned with, then one need not worry too much about Yama Niyama, although I would say even that is important. Because basically if I define Yama Niyama, it simply means moderation in everything. Moderation. In the Gita, Krishna puts it beautifully, or Vyasa puts it beautifully, saying this yoga is not for him who eats too much or eats too little, or sleeps too much or sleeps too little. That kind of is a metaphor to define moderation. I know lots of people who are quite fine who have a glass of wine in the evening. The problem is it doesn't stop with one after supper. you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not saying you should drink wine or should not drink wine. I'm just giving you an example in modern world example of how excesses can be avoided.
Right.
And food. Don't starve yourself. A yogi is not one who starves himself to death and does tapasya. That is not tapasya according to yoga. Yoga needs a healthy body, so you need enough food, good nutrition. In fact, Patanjali says the finest part of your food goes to form your mind. So mind is also considered a material object. So probably they are referring to the brain here in this context.
Right. Right. Right.
So yama niyamas are basically moderation plus things like not causing injury to others,
Right.
being contented and tranquil under all circumstances and so on, which can be developed little by little. One day it can't be done. So yama niyama. Then asana. Now Yoga Sutras of Patanjali do not describe any asanas. Although asana is mentioned, you cannot find asana and different postures in it. Patanjali simply says sthira sukham asanam. That's a posture in which you can be for a length of time in comfort. That is your asana. This is his definition. Then he moves on. Now, if one wants to refer to asanas, one has to go to books like Hatha Yoga Pradipika and so on, which are detailed mention about asanas. So, but Patanjali does mention asanas in the Sadhana Pada because physical health is very important. Plus, many of the asanas are not just muscle building tricks, they are something to do with one's endocrine system, the ductless glands. Shirsasana, for instance, to give you an example, increases the circulation of blood in your head, in your brain, and therefore, which is the master gland that controls our emotions and everything, is the pituitary.
Pituitary.
Pituitary. Some of the pineal controls our sleep and waking circuits, so the circadian rhythm. So blood circulation, normally we don't have much blood circulation here because we are creatures who walk straight, and there are people who refuse to bow down to anybody because they think it's terrible to bow down.
Which is interesting. So there's a very strong, good physiological reason to go as often as possible.
Absolutely. I tell people, if you don't want to bow down to anybody, fine. Shut the doors and bow down to the earth. In olden days, they used to have temples with small doors so that you bow down even to enter. What happens? Circulation increases. So you have Sarvangasana, Shirsasana, you know.
Right.
Now, anger can be controlled through massaging the adrenal glands. Matsyasana is very helpful. So, what I am trying to say is asanas are not merely physical, they also have some effect on your emotions, your mindset and so on.
Right.
And then you have pranayama, which is balancing the breath. The yogis believe that erratic breathing does not contribute to well-being, either physically or mentally. So you learn the different techniques by which the breath is adjusted properly.
Right.
And brought into rhythm through the nadis.
Right.
Pranayama. Then pratyahara, which means the capacity to switch on and switch off your mind from anything that you want to do in an instant. This is very important. This comes through, you see, if you are equipped with pratyahara, then you can practically survive in this world without any difficulty. Forget about higher spiritual things.
Right.
So a yogi, when he is driving, he's not meditating. You will know, you know what happens if you are meditating in the highway with the steering wheel. So when he is meditating, he is not thinking of his car.
He's not driving, yeah.
So this thing is pratyahara. Although it has been described for some people as sense withdrawal and so on, but I think it's not just sense withdrawal, it's being able to switch and switch off at any time. Then there is dharana, dhyana and samadhi, the last three parts of Ashtanga Yoga. Dharana is fixing your one pointed attention on anything that you want. It could be idea, object, anything. Sound. And dhyana is the continuation of that dharana. I'm trying to put it in a nutshell. And when one is in deep dhyana, when dharana continues, then the experience of samadhi takes place, which is described in the beginning, the first chapter itself,
Right.
where a human being unconditions himself.
Correct.
This is the
Right.
samadhi.
So, got it. So this is very interesting. So Samadhipada gave us sort of the background and definitely gave us clarity on objective. What are we trying to do here? And then Sadhanapada takes over in a sense. And what it does is it tells you what you need to do, the actions that you need to do, but it's not limited at all to asanas.
No.
It has these 8 limbs or 8
Exactly.
things.
Exactly.
And many of them, and one aspect of that is asana, of course, but there are 7 other aspects. And understanding that in totality is really a key part of thinking
Prakriti.
about your path of being a yogi.
Exactly. Of Kaivalya. Yes.
Of Kaivalya. Okay, so I think we've kind of got some sense of these two, which these are very deep propositions. So
May I also add?
Yeah.
Add that a
Sure.
yogi need not change his robes. He need not either grow hair or shave it off in his head, on his head. He need not wear any paraphernalia. He may if he wants, but it's not required. He can lead a normal life,
Right. Correct.
normal in quotes, and still be a yogi. This is very important to note.
Yeah. So what's external is not so. It's not the thing. Really, what you know, what you are doing is the thing.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay, great. Now, before we go to the next two, and we probably have to do that a little quicker. But I want to just spend time on one phrase on which you actually spend time on. And I think it comes up in a lot of discussions on yoga,
What?
which is the word Kundalini.
Oh,
Right?
Kundalini.
It's Kundalini. I wanted to talk about that, and I just wanted to sort of bring that up. It's a phrase you refer to in a note separately at the end of the book, and I found that fascinating because it's a phrase that repeats itself in so many conversations and so many books, and something that is often very difficult to really fully, get around. So, would you like to tell us a little bit about Kundalini?
Yeah. Look, first let me tell you, nowhere in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali there is a mention of the word Kundalini.
Oh,
Nowhere.
okay.
Nor is it mentioned in the early principal Upanishads anywhere. The word Kundalini is mentioned in some of the later Upanishads, the Yoga Upanishads,
Oh, okay.
where it is referred to as Kula Kundali. And
Kundalini.
the place where Kundalini is often referred to are the Yoga Tantras. For instance, something like Sat Chakra Nirupana, which author Avalon translated into English and wrote The Serpent Power. But if you look through all the pages of Patanjali's Yoga, you will not find the word Kundalini there.
Kundalini.
Okay. Now, there are, of course, Kundalini has been mentioned in many places in the Yoga Tantras. But the reason why I hesitate to use the word Kundalini is nowadays it has become very cheap. There are some magazines where advertise that for 3,000 bucks you can raise your Kundalini. Now we have been working all our lives to do it. Is this possible? Anyway, so let's see what this means. What this energy. In the Tantras and also in Sankhya, of course, the ultimate energy, supreme energy is called Shakti, Parashakti.
Okay.
Now, that means energy in toto, primordial energy. The whole universe functions because of a primordial energy inside. In the human being, this energy becomes prana, life energy.
Okay.
Among them, the most important is what is called Mukhya Prana, the most important energy. Now, according to the science of yoga, the body has many channels called nadis through which the energy prana operates. Right. But there are 3 channels or 3 nadis which are most important for us. One is the one on the left called the Ida, the one on the right called the Pingala, the one in the center called the Shushumna. Please, it is not mentioned anywhere in the Yoga Sutras. I'm talking from the Yoga Tantras.
Okay.
Yeah, so these are the three main. Now, the Pingala is called the plus energy, and the Ida is called the minus energy. Not like positive, negative, but something like a anode and a cathode. Let's put it that way. In electricity, you can't say cathode is bad because it is minus.
Yeah.
Both are
It's different. Yeah.
exactly
Yeah.
charges.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the Ida Pingala also has plus and minus. And for most of our activities on this earth, including high thinking, this, that, everything, the prana flowing through Ida Pingala is enough. However, if one wants to increase one's conscious awareness, or if one wants to, what shall I call it, to turn Tejas into Ojas, I don't know, sublimate. If one wants to sublimate one's gross energies into subtler ones, if one wants to move in other dimensions which are not open normally to the Ida Pingala functioning, then the energy, the prana, has to move through the Shushumna, which is the central channel of the spine. This is the anatomy and physiology of it. Yogic anatomy physiology.
Right. Sure.
Right. Now, if you ask me, is there anything in the human body which is similar to this? Yes. The left and the right channels are usually like the right and left vagus nerves, the
Vagus nerves.
what you might call the parasympathetic system.
Nervous system. Yeah.
Sympathetic, parasympathetic. And the central one is the cerebrospinal system. This is the physical part of what we were discussing. But this energy is not physical.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Got it.
Now, what is described is that, you know, for a human being, after food and shelter, the most enjoyable thing is sex.
Sure.
Everything is built basically in society nowadays towards that in some way. It's not bad or good, I'm just saying.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now, if you ask somebody what is the greatest joy you have ever experienced, he would say the culmination of sex.
Sure.
Now, the yogis say that this is because this energy called Mukhya Prana or Kundalini, after doing the work of creating the physical body, resides in the end of the spine in the center called the Mooladhara, the root foundation. And that is responsible also for sex.
Oh, okay.
Right. So, when it moves downward to through the lower center, one experiences this ecstasy of physical sex.
Right.
Now, when Adi Shankara wrote the Saundarya Lahari, it means the ecstasy of beauty. He is talking about if this could be, this energy can be made, sublimated, and instead of being used only for a physical purpose, can it be made, taken for higher levels of existence. When this happens naturally, the enjoyment that takes place is much more than anything that you can do with only the Mooladhara.
Right. Got it.
So, the whole process is sublimation, which is why the Mooladhara's tattva is Prakriti. Therefore, it's earth.
It's earth.
The next one is water, Swadhisthana, Apas. Then you have the Agni, the combustion, which turns this into vapor. And here is air, Vayu. Here is Akasha, which can't be defined, primordial material. And then from here, the indefinable. Right. So, to shift one's awareness from the lowest center of gross matter to subtler levels of consciousness is called the awakening of awareness, or you can call it the awakening of the Kundalini. Since it is the same thing associated with the enjoyment one has in sex, different levels of enjoyment take place, and the yogi is in complete ecstasy as this rises up. Ecstasy may not be in Muladhara, it may be in many other centers, and therefore once one is hooked to that, there is no escape.
It's the ultimate drug.
You got it. So then you wouldn't. Then there is no effort to do this. I mean, it's you enjoy it.
Right.
You see,
It's a
so
stage.
this is going. And traditionally, it has been described as a snake coiled 3.5 times and sleeping. That was a great metaphor used, because when the snake, cobra especially, when it's sleeping, it's completely silent, and then you poke it with something and it gets up and hisses, opens its hood, starts looking. In the same way, this energy is normally asleep in most people through certain methods, mantra, yantra, tantra, or yoga tantras. Serpent power is about awakening this energy through the practice of mudras and pranayama. There are also other methods like Shri Vidya, which is awakening the energy through the chanting of certain sounds,
Right.
Bijaksharas. And then there is the external worship of yantras. Basically, it means to sublimate this energy from gross to subtle, from lesser enjoyment to refined, better enjoyment.
Right.
So roughly this is what Kundalini is about. For the time that we have, this is as much that we can say. It's a big subject. It's a vast subject.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, it's a vast subject, and I think nobody's trying to sort of find the final answer in a short conversation. But I think it's very useful because I think it gives us again a context to think about it, and I think it's a part of the practice. When you think about the practice, you are aware that this is an important thing. It's somewhere there. You need
It's
to
there.
work of it.
Yes.
So let's quickly move on, Sriyam, to the other two, Vibhuti Pada and Kaivalya Pada. Would you like to sort of spend a little bit of time and tell us both these?
Vibhuti Pada and Kaivalya Pada. Yes.
Correct.
Now, as the yogi practices to rise to higher levels of consciousness, his mind and his entire instrument of the body becomes more powerful and more sensitive and has a greater reach than the ordinary man who is not doing it. Therefore, certain extraordinary powers begin to manifest in the yogi. But the yogis want that your ultimate aim is the samadhi state and don't get caught up with this, but it happens. For instance, a quiet mind can tune into another mind and easily say what the other guy is thinking about. It may be deliberate, it may be just happening automatically.
Fascinating.
Also, the body and the mind become very light. Both the body and the mind become very light. And it's easy to attain any knowledge that you require simply by fixing your attention on it, because you have acquired the capacity to put one pointed attention into whatever you want. Plus, the mind being not disturbed by conflicts and opposites has become crystal clear. So it reflects things which the ordinary mind cannot reflect. So therefore, people say, "Oh, he's a great yogi. He has unparalleled powers of perception, of achievement." But a true yogi is not happy just with that. He needs to go above that, because then again it becomes an attachment.
Correct, and it's certainly a part of the path. I mean, going back to the very first, what is it that we were trying to achieve?
It's not the aim. It so happens that while you go towards Kaivalya, these things happen. And I remember a great yogi telling me that you are traveling from Chennai to Kashi. Your aim is to reach Kashi Vishwanath. On the way, the train stops. You stop at one of the stalls, and then you see the wares that are exhibited there, and you get attracted by them, and you are trying to find out. The train goes off. You have to take another train. You have to wait many hours before you go to Kashi. So, while one develops extraordinary capacities, One has to be
Right.
very careful of not getting lost in it and moving forward. So, this is Vibhuti. Vibhuti means capacities, extraordinary capacities. It's not just ash. Vibhuti is.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.
So,
No, but that's interesting because that means that two points for the person looking at yoga. I mean, it as both as a practitioner and somebody trying to understand it, is that it is likely that you will see this happen to you as you move forward, and remember that it is therefore clearly a particular place in your journey. And I think that's the
exactly.
great message that
Yes. That
you
is the
can sort of
message.
get.
That this is not the end, but you have grown now, you have flowered, but the ultimate has not been gained. So don't get lost in this. That's the message.
Got it. Got it.
Okay.
Which then takes us, of course, to Kaivalya.
Kaivalya. Now, Kaivalya, as I said, is this complete freedom where the mind, the mind has become so clear and pure and tranquil without the vrittis. So tranquil, and we have also decided that I don't want to get caught up in this extraordinary attainments, achievements, and so on, worldly attainments. So the mind is not even craving for that. Such a clear mind then no longer remains a mind, there is only Purusha.
Okay.
So when Purusha is there, there is no bondage, there is nothing more to attain. So there is no other desire to go anywhere. Everything settles down, and then one realizes one is alone and quiet. When I say alone, it doesn't mean isolated. Solitude. There is this tremendous solitude of oneness. You know, sometimes alone can be split into two words and say all one.
Interesting.
Roughly that. There is nowhere to go, nowhere to come, but you are in this world, you can function in this world. It doesn't mean that if you have Kaivalya, you cannot function in this world. In fact, you can function better than normal, better than usual. But you know that deep down, everything is settled, everything is tranquil, one is free, and there is only the Purusha, the self, the ultimate self. And you see it working through your little self. But not get caught up in it.
Got it.
This extraordinary state is called Kaivalya. I don't think anybody who touches Kaivalya will want anything more. I mean, that's the end. It's not end in the sense that there is nothing more to come. The greatest attraction here is it is not something that, oh, this is the limit and it's finished. No. In a way, it's endless. It's not like a big bang and finished. Like there are many bangs going on after that.
Got it. It's very interesting. So would you say, and I'm just trying to put into words that all of us accept is not easy to put into words. So so one of the interesting things that I notice about this is when I think about what you just said about Kaivalya is that we've been doing a lot of practice. We've been doing a whole bunch of things to get to a place.
Yes.
And that place seems to me to be a place of discovery more than anything else, where you get to know something, not achieve something.
Exactly.
Would you,
there is a difference in the two, you know.
Yes,
To
yes.
discover
I think there is
something and to achieve. The achieve, there is something like grasping and groping.
yeah.
Here, all groping is over. You're discovering new things. Every day, every minute, you're discovering new things.
Right.
And that is kind of infinite. This will be a rough idea of what Kaivalya is. I mean,
Got it.
we
Got
can't be
it.
so accurate about this.
Of course, words will definitely fail at some level because I would imagine many of these
In
things.
fact, the Upanishad says words fail. Yet vacha na abhyutitam, that which words cannot describe.
Right. Steve, I'm going to take one more minute. The conversation has been fascinating, and I don't want to close it, but there is always a certain time.
Sure.
But I want to take a minute more. And I want to ask you a question which I can't be answered in a minute, but I definitely want to still spend one more minute on it. And that is the other one concept and a phrase and a practice or whatever you call it that you've talked about in the book, and that is Om.
Oh,
I just want you to spend a little while on the context of Om. What is Om and the context of Om in all of this?
First of all, let me say that Om should not be looked at in any denominational sense. It doesn't belong to any denomination. It's a sound.
Sound.
It so happens that in ancient times the language that was then prevalent was Sanskrit. So it is there in that language. But actually Om is a sound. It is a primordial sound. It's not as if other teachings don't haven't touched upon this. If you go to the Bible, St. John's, you will find that the beginning of creation is described as in the beginning was the Word, and Word is Vak in Sanskrit.
Right.
And the Word was God, and the Word was God. Now let me quote the Rig Veda for you. Prajapati vaidamagriyasit. Prajapati, the Supreme, was their only beginning. Tasya Vak divityasid, and that Prajapati was the Vak, the sound. Vak vai parabrahmam, that word is the Supreme Being. So the Om is a sound which takes us through the different layers of consciousness, from waking to dream to deep sleep and beyond, to Turiya, which yoga calls Kaivalya.
Right.
So even if you have no other practice, if you sit down and quietly chant Om as a sound and listen to it carefully, it can bring about changes in your body, mind and consciousness. This is the important. In the Mundaka, in the Kathopanishad, after describing the entire thing, the Lord of Death, Yama, says to Nachiketas, so Nachiketas, you have described that the self is the reality and so on and so forth, and it is deathless, but how do we get there? Yama says there is a bridge, and that is called Om, the Pranava. You know, so, and any other mantra you can add Pranava. It's called Pranava because it's life-giving. It can also be chanted independently. Now, since we don't have much time and we are on the subject, I'll stop. I'll end this by saying there are two kinds of Om. One is the Om with A, U and Ma. The other is Om direct with more stress on the Ma. The other Om is good for you and good for the world also. The other Om with Om, this is good for your own system because it touches upon the different centers and awakens them. And it's also very soothing. It is the most common sound. If you go to a convalescent ward of a hospital, the most common sound you hear is because the brain knows there is a built-in system that this is a soothing word. It soothes your entire system. So we have different forms of chanting of Om, which is technical, of course, in the yogic science.
Right.
You can learn it from a person and chant, but chanting of Om is the bridge between the visible world and that which is beyond. This is how the Upanishads is.
Beautiful. And I think that gives us a tremendous sort of roundup, in a sense, and a conclusion to a wonderful, wonderful conversation. Sriam, thank you very much.
Thank you,
particularly, I want to thank you. I want to just say a sort of a personal experience of this book once again is that, as somebody who's gone into yoga through very much a life experience. I was running a company, doing whatever, and that demands certain things from you as a human being.
Absolutely.
And then you get into yoga as a kind of counterpoint to that, so to speak. And then as you go into it, you realize there's more to it than just being that. And I think one has tried to do a little bit of reading here and there, but I must say that this book gave me a lot of sort of
Thank you.
context to the whole thing. Put it all together for me.
I'm glad. I'm very glad.
Very simple, very easy, and it gave me Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. So thank you very much once again.
Thank you again. Thank you very much.